Hello friends, my name is JJ, and I'm very into trying to understand the culture of a country by taking a close look at its national symbols, and not just cliched things like the flag or national anthem, but less government-y stuff too. In the past, we've done videos discussing things like national foods and iconic national photographs, and today I want to talk about famous national speeches. And as usual, I'm going to need a lot of help from my wonderfully international audience in coming up with some good examples, in part because, of course, different countries speak different languages, making speeches not always the easiest thing to research for a unilingual like me. So what makes for a truly iconic, nationally important speech? Well, I have come up with a few ground rules. The first is that it has to be some sort of formal, planned, public statement. It doesn't have to be particularly long. In fact, I would say one of the most famous speeches in the entire history of the solar system is only 11 words.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But the speech does have to be for some specific occasion or event. It can't just be like an interview or a press conference or something. Not all speeches are 100% scripted, but they all serve an intended purpose. The second rule is that the iconic status of a speech doesn't have to correlate with its importance or even its moral goodness. As is so often the case with cultural symbols, fame does not imply virtue. For instance, a very famous speech during the American Civil Rights Movement was delivered by the notoriously racist governor of Alabama, George Wallace.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Finally, the last rule is that the speech must have produced at least one very memorable, highly quotable line that has in turn infiltrated the broader popular culture. It can't just be a speech that was important in theory, it has to have penetrated the public imagination to the point where it wouldn't be surprising to see a line from it on, like, I don't know, a barbecue apron. All right, now let me give you a few examples of iconic national speeches from the English-speaking world to show you what I mean. I'll just stick with speeches from the last 100 years. So there are a lot to choose from in America, but I would think at this point, most people would probably say the most iconic American speech of the last century is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech at the 1963 March on Washington.
We will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Dr. King was, of course, an extremely important figure in the fight for racial equality in the US, and his typically charismatic 1963 speech, delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial before a multiracial crowd of over 200,000 people in the nation's capital, is often seen as embodying his pinnacle of influence before his murder 4 years later. They call it the "I Have a Dream" speech because the most famous part has Dr. King describing various ways in which he hopes that America of the future will be better than the America of today, with this being the line that everybody remembers most of all.
Because I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Now this is an example of a speech that is both famous and good, because these days, almost everybody in America, be they on the left, right, or center, claims to revere the sentiments that King expresses in it. In fact, if anything, it is now so sentimentalized that it can even come off as a little bit treacly, which is actually something that King worried about at the time. But then there's also the fact that as the decades have gone on, this speech has also become increasingly meme-ified, as historical things often do. Whenever there's any sort of rioting over racial issues in America, for instance, you can always count on someone to draw a cartoon, something like this one from 1992. "I have a dream. I have a VCR." The good old Onion did a pretty funny parody of it as well in their hilarious book, Our Dumb Century. By the way, this is one of my favorite books of all time, and if you are remotely interested in history or politics, you absolutely must get it, because it is some of the most brilliant satire I've ever read. But anyway, their take on Martin Luther King went like this. Martin Luther King, I had a really weird dream last night. And it sort of reimagines his speech in this very literal way, in which he's just describing a strange dream he had in the kind of boring and awkward way people often describe their dreams. I had a dream in which I was in Yankee Stadium, but it was not really Yankee Stadium. It seemed more like a combination of Yankee Stadium and my house, and there I stood, for reasons not known to me, in the shadow of the bleachers of that great stadium. I had a dream in which the great stadium became filled with circus animals. Whether these animals came from a circus or zoo, I am not certain. And as I walked through the congregation of animals, it became obvious to me that I did not walk alone. I noticed that I was joined by my friend Morton Walsh, who I know from law school. I do not know why he was there suddenly, but it just occurs to me that I had been thinking about him just the other day while going through some old papers from that time. Or how about the sad tale of Howard Dean? Dean was the governor of Vermont who ran for president in the Democratic Party primary of 2004. And after losing the Iowa caucuses, he famously embarrassed himself by giving this weird high-pitched shriek.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House! Ah!
Media wags quickly dubbed it his I have a scream speech, and it was thought that this withering put-down helped torpedo his entire political career. And speaking of politics, let us now look at another very iconic American speech, the inaugural address of John F. Kennedy in 1961.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Kennedy was a very beloved president, and his cleverly phrased call to public service has kept this speech in the American public memory for decades, though increasingly it is probably better known as just a thing people make jokes about in pop culture.
Ask not what your colony can do for you. Ask what you can do for your colony.
Ask not what your student body president can do for you. Ask what you can do to your student body president's body.
As I always said, ask not what a mystery can do for you, but what you can do for a mystery.
Hey, that quote's not even from Lincoln.
The only Kennedy speech more famous than that one is possibly the speech he gave in West Germany in June of 1963. In those days, the divided city of Berlin was a common symbol of the tensions between the communist East and the democratic West. So Kennedy whips out another clever line where he pledges his loyalty to these people on this critical front of the Cold War.
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Which of course has been parodied up the wazoo as well.
Welcome, swappers, to the Springfield Swap Meet. Ich bin ein Springfield Swap Meet patron.
I am your bridge. Ich bin ein Nerd.
Ask not what I can do for you, ask what you can do for me.
Ich bin ein Sucker.
New Orleans von Manila gegen Seed, sagte Kennedy, ich bin ein Berliner.
The Ich bin ein Berliner line proved so famous, in fact, that there is even a whole urban legend about it, in which people say that JFK screwed up the German and unintentionally humiliated himself. My YouTube buddy Canubus made a whole video on it. All right, now how about the UK? I don't think it's possible to talk about iconic British speeches without mentioning those of Winston Churchill, Britain's wartime leader, who was famous for his catchy lines. In fact, many of Churchill's lines were so catchy, I would argue a lot of them have actually overshadowed the context of the specific speeches in which they were given. For example, you might know this famous line.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender.
But what was the context? Well, if you've seen the movie Darkest Hour, you'll know it was a speech Churchill gave to the British Parliament on June 4th, 1940.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Right after the evacuation of British troops from France following the Nazi invasion of that country, a key moment in the early days of World War II. And then there was this one.
So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
This was another speech to Parliament, delivered just a few days after the first one, on June 18th, 1940, following France's formal conquest by Germany. By that point, it was really seen as Britain standing alone against Hitler, hence the grandiosity of Churchill's words. But even if the exact context isn't necessarily remembered, both the fight them on the beaches and the finest hour speeches and maybe a couple others too, have become key pieces of the heavily sentimentalized culture the British have built up over the years about their wartime experiences. You know, this proud patriotic legend of how the people of Britain all came together to fight the Nazis and save both their country and the world. And the motivating power of Churchill's speeches forms a big part of that. But what's interesting about these speeches is that there are a lot of urban legends and even, dare I say, primitive Mandela effects about them as well. The big one is that none of these speeches were actually broadcast live from Parliament because that technology did not exist at the time. The audio of the finest hour speech that I played was actually a repeat version of the speech that Churchill recorded for the BBC later that same night, while the Fight Them on the Beaches recording was actually one that Churchill taped long after the war ended in 1949 as part of a Churchill's Greatest Hits record. A lot of Brits would have just read transcripts of these speeches in the newspapers, as opposed to being huddled around their radios like we often imagine. Nevertheless, according to this Smithsonian article, a lot of Brits from the war generation maintained until their dying days that they remember hearing these speeches live on the radio and refused to accept that this was impossible. And then some other people ran equally hard in the other direction and spread conspiracy theories that all of Churchill's wartime speeches were actually faked in some way and delivered by actors and so on. But if anything, I feel like all of these legends and counter-legends just prove how much power these speeches have in British culture. Alright, so how about another famous British leader? Queen Elizabeth II. She's been around for a while, but an interesting or possibly depressing thing about her is just how few memorable speeches she's given during her 70 plus years on the throne. This is partly because she just doesn't speak directly to the British public all that often. Her televised speech about the coronavirus last year, for instance, was only the 4th ever national address she's ever given. And this in turn is supposedly because she is said to have an extremely conservative opinion on what is appropriate for a monarch to weigh in on. The movie The Queen, for instance, is all about her apprehension about making a speech about the 1997 death of Princess Diana. The speech she wound up giving in the end was nothing special, but I guess you could argue it is still iconic despite failing my quotability test. I'm actually now just having a personal memory of that speech. I was in high school at that time, and I was in class at the time that the Queen was scheduled to make her Diana speech. And the principal came on the loudspeaker and he was like, "We can all come down to the auditorium to watch the speech live." And then a few minutes later, he came on the speaker again and he was like, actually, the speech is already over and it wasn't that great, so you can just stay where you are." The Queen also gave a speech in 1992 that arguably broke into the culture a little bit more. This was a speech she gave at a banquet in the London City Hall, in which she spoke a little bit more openly than usual about some of the stresses she felt as a queen in the modern world, particularly some of the tabloid scandals that had ensnared her family that year.
In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
Annus horribilis was considered a pretty clever line, since it plays on the Latin phrase annus mirabilis, or miracle year, which is apparently somewhat well known in British culture. In any case, annus horribilis has now sort of taken on a life of its own as a sort of shorthand for the problems of the British royal family. With any time another bad thing happens to the Windsors, the press being like, "Is this the next annus horribilis?" Alrighty, now let us talk about my country, Canada. Now, I'm sorry to say, I don't think there actually have been that many famous speeches in Canadian history. I don't know why, but it is what it is. Racking my brain, the most iconic one I can probably think of is the speech that the separatist Prime Minister of Quebec, Jacques Parizeau, gave in 1995 after voters in his province very narrowly voted down a referendum on making Quebec into a separate country.
C'est vrai qu'on a été battu au fond par quoi? Par l'argent puis des votes ethniques, essentiellement. Alors, ça veut dire que la prochaine fois, au lieu d'être 60 ou 61% à voter oui, on sera 63 ou 64, et ça s'ira. C'est tout.
Quebec separatists had often been accused of pandering to racist and anti-Semitic elements among the French-Canadian public in order to build up support. So Parizeau's implication that money and the ethnics had somehow stolen the vote from the real Quebecers, i.e. the 60% of French Canadians who had voted in favor, was seen as one more indictment of the whole movement. The line "money and the ethnic vote" would go on to become this kind of shorthand used to beat up Quebec separatists for many years after 1995. It was used to imply that the separatist movement was just fundamentally paranoid and bigoted, which overlapped with growing disinterest in the cause of Quebec separatism in general. When Parizeau died a few years ago, discussion of his 95 speech was in all of the obituaries and sometimes even the headlines. So anyway, now it is your turn, my friends. Thinking about your country, what is an example of a speech that plays a similar role in your national culture? Again, it doesn't have to be a good speech or a heroic one, but it does have to be famous and quotable. Give me some good nominees in the comments and I will use them to make a sequel video. Just don't forget to translate.